All right, welcome to another 92 gaming video. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different again. Since I started playing standards, this standard format in October, I believe, and I wanted to do a top 5 list of overplayed or overvalued cards. Up first, we have green. And if you've been watching any of my videos where I play deck lists, Skewed Swarm in green is constantly played in green decks. I don't understand why. I mean, I think maybe at some point in a previous standard season, it was played more heavily and it might have been a lot better. But now where we have stuff like Meat Hook Massacre and a lot of other mass removal spells, I don't think it's as good as it potentially could have been. There's also not there's only 2 lands right now in standard that allow you to get another land out of your deck. So you have Evolving Wilds, which in and of itself is probably not a terrible card, but it's not quite as good as it could be. And then the other one is Field of Ruin, which sees a ton of play. So in that sense, if you're playing Skewed Swarm, you really want to be playing both of those cards, I think. But I see it played constantly, and every time I play with the card seems to fall flat. I never really want to have it before turn 6, basically, so I want to play it on 6, and then be able to play a fetch land like Evolving Wilds or Field of Ruin or something like that, and then be able to crack it and then get another Skewed Swarm so it copies itself instead of just making a 1/1 instant token. I think that's where the strength of the card is. So it's essentially a 6 drop that costs 3 mana. And then it's only a 1/1. I suppose that's something else that I should say too. But and every time I play it, I think it's terrible. There have been instances where it's really, really sweet, but again, I think I've said it in a previous video. I think the card is just it's just overkill most of the time. I was likely already winning the match, irregardless of Skewed Swarm. So for green, I have to give the overplayed or overvalued card to Skewed Swarm. And next up for white, I had a hard time finding something for white. I had to really look hard because a lot of the white cards that I was looking at were actually really, really good and in context are playable, and not just, overly played or overvalued. Generally, if you're playing one of the white cards, it's going to do something given whatever particular matchup you might be playing in. So I had to kind of look pretty deep going into white. I ended up coming up with Reduced to Memory. It is a 3 mana lesson. And the reason why it gets the overplayed or overvalued, it tends to pop up in every single deck that is playing the Professor of Symbology. And I just don't think it's quite good enough. I mean, what tends to happen a lot of the time is the opponent will, I don't generally play this card. I try not to. I have played it in the past, obviously. But usually what ends up happening is you're spending 3 mana at sorcery speed to give them a 3/2 and maybe get rid of something that you normally wouldn't be able to get rid of. I think the Introduction to Annihilation, I think, is definitely the better card. Not only it just replaces it with another card. So while it's a little bit more expensive and still sorcery speed, it doesn't give them another threat, basically. Because while a 3/2 sometimes doesn't seem like much, and maybe you're playing against a deck that's maybe like Teleportation Circle going or something crazy, or maybe they have, like Hallowed Haunting or something going, then I can understand it. So if it's a permanent like that, I can see the merit to some degree. But generally, I find that I've always seen it in sideboards, and every time I play it, it feels terrible, and every time I try to get it, it feels terrible. And whenever my opponent has played it against me, it's generally not good for them. Basically, paying 3 mana to replace one threat with another, even though it's a 3/2, this doesn't seem like it's a good trade to me. Not in standard anyway, for sure. And next up, we have in blue, we have Necroduality. Now, this one might be a bit controversial, maybe. It can make the blue black zombie deck sing. But again, I think much like Skewed Swarm, I think it just is a win more card. Basically what you want to do with Necroduality is hold a lot of your really sweet zombies until after you play it, because there's not a lot of card draw in the blue-black zombies deck list, and you don't really want to hold them until after. You want to basically play your curve out. You want to basically one drop, double one drop, or maybe a 2-drop, and then on turn 3 you want 1 drop and then 2-drop. You don't want to have a card that does nothing the turn that you play it. So when you play it on turn 4, you basically have to wait until turn 5 until you play something else. Now, there are certain instances where, and maybe certain matchups where it's good, but I think the blue-black zombies deck can do without it for sure. I think the Overcharged Amalgam at 4 mana, I think, is way, way better than playing Necroduality, and maybe you could make a case for playing both. But again, you're talking 4 mana in a deck that's trying to be aggressive. And you don't want cards like this. I think it's like I said, it's very similar to the Skewed Swarm, and it's kind of like a win more card. So I would have to say the Overplayed card for blue is Necroduality. As much as I think the card is sweet, if there was a bunch of zombies after turn 4 that you could play, and there was some way of getting to that point and then being able to play it, and if there was good 5 mana zombie and 6 mana zombies and whatnot, then I could see you could make the case for it. But I think besides that, there's really not. I think there's only like 2 zombies in the entire format that you can play after turn 4. So like at 5 mana and 6 mana. And for red, next up we have is the Leyline Tyrant. I'm constantly seeing this card played in decks that play Dragonfire, so you have the 4 power, and it's another dragon. There's other dragons at 4 mana. The Mana Form Hellkite, and as a 4 mana dragon, especially where it's a mythic wild card as well, don't think it's worth it. You also have like Moonveil Regent, and you have the Mana Form Hellkite as well at 4 mana. So this card has a lot of competition. Now I understand it was out before. This card was out before those, so maybe people still have it and people still play it. But I constantly see this card being played, and it constantly underperforms at 4 mana. Essentially, the way I look at it is the one benefit that it has is that you don't lose unspent red mana. Pass a turn, if it doesn't die, you untap. Then you can tap 4 mana and save it basically until you can either until somebody either kills it, and then you can deal 4 damage to any target. So again, now you're at 8 mana, or you have the possibility, I guess, of the following turn. I guess if you were to curve and you were to go 4 mana this, then next turn have 5 mana, tap it and save it, then you can deal 5 damage with it. That's not that terrible, but again, it's 2 turns, sorcery speed. If it doesn't die that turn, then you could tap and have mana floating and then spend it if somebody decides to kill it on your turn. But again, now you're talking 9 mana and 2 turns and 1 card for 5 damage, essentially. What amounts to about 5 damage. So maybe at one point in Standard before this new season or before this rotation, it might have been a bit better, but now we have better options. So I don't think this card's very good at all, given the other 4 mana dragons that are in the format. So now we're into the black cards, and a card that I think that is overvalued or overplayed, depending on how you want to word it, is Turgid, God of Fright. And with this card here specifically, I constantly see decks with that have black mana, that have access to black mana, will play this, especially Blood on the Snow decks with snow-covered lands, stuff like that. Again, this comes back to the same premise as the Skewed Swarm and some of the other cards on this list, where it's kind of a win more card. Now, the front side of Turgid, I think, is actually not that bad because it's a 4/5 menace, and then whenever they sacrifice a non-token permanent or they discard a permanent card, you get control of it. So I think that's fine. But I tend to see a lot of people play it for the backside, where they think it's a lightning bolt for a tap, and then you can basically, untap it and then lightning bolt them again. It doesn't work that way, because if it was just tap and they lose 3 life, then yes, I could see that. Then I don't think we would see the untap part of it. But if they have the sacrifice or they have the option to discard a card, it's you're giving the opponent, number one, you're giving them three choices basically. They can take 3 life, they can or they can lose 3 life rather. They can sacrifice the non-land permanent, or they can discard a card. Now, there's a number of things. If they have a lot of life, then making them lose 3 life doesn't matter. You're not going to affect their hand. If they have to sacrifice a non-land permanent, it may have extra treasure tokens lying around, whatever it happens to be. Or if they discard a card, again, they might have a bunch of lands in hand, so it doesn't really matter. Now, at the point where you get to with Tergrid, where it can start being a lightning bolt, is when they have no non-land permanents and they have no cards in hand. And I think if you get to that point, I think you're already winning the game. Now, this can be, you can say it can potentially be a finisher at that stage, but I think anything at 4 mana that your opponent can't answer and they have no cards in hand and no cards in play, it doesn't matter what the 4 mana card is, you're going to win with it. So for that reason, I think this card is really overplayed, and I think potentially misplayed. I think the 5 mana, 4/5 menace side is a lot better than the other side, but I continuously see people play it for the other side, and a lot of times where it's played against me, I'm like, if you had played it for the other side and then maybe cast your discard spell, then I would have been in trouble, because then you would have gotten whatever permanents I would have had to have discarded. So for black, I think this is definitely an overvalued and overplayed card. I don't necessarily think I don't think any of these cards on this list are necessarily terrible, except maybe for the next one on the list. But for the most part, they're just way overplayed, and I think people play them as almost as like an auto include, and I don't think that they are. Finally, we come to gold, artifacts, and lands. And there's not a lot of gold cards being played, which I think is why, there's certain cards that are seeing a lot more play, stuff like Vanishing Verse and stuff like that. So you don't really have to get rid of too many gold permanents. So I couldn't really find anything there that's overplayed. And same with artifacts, same thing. I think there's the artifacts that are played tend to be very good in the decks that play them. Like the Strixhaven Stadium, I think in the deck that plays it with Teferi, I think is very good. So in that deck specifically, I think it's fine. There's a bunch of other ones as well. The Celestis as well, I think is a very good card. But when you get to the lands, I think I guess I would call them the Snarl cycle from Strixhaven. I hate these dual lands. I think they're fine if you need extra dual lands. They're not much different than the old, like the dual lands, maybe I think from M20 or whenever they were printed last, where they're just two colors and they come into play tapped. That's fine. But they give the illusion of being good because it comes into play on tap. Now, maybe in other formats where you might have other dual lands count as either, then I think it's fine. I think they're okay in that sense. But generally, if you need to play a bunch of dual lands, you want this to come into play untapped on turn 1, where you need it to, because there's the possibility exists. Because the other ones, where they tap for 2 different colors, as opposed to the flip cycle that's in Zendikar, where you pick one side or the other. So you pick one basic land or the other. This one you can tap for either or. So maybe you have with the Frostboil Snarl, you have maybe a shock on turn 1 and maybe like a Delver Secrets. So you either want the access to the red or you want the access to the blue. They're still overvalued, I think. That would be the only case where you would want to have this card. Maybe you want a blue or red, and it doesn't matter the other lands that you have in hand, or that you do have a bunch of other lands in hand. So it can come into play untapped on turn 2. Beyond turn 2, you start running the risk again. I solely play on Arena, and at least for the standard format, I solely play on Arena. And what I find with this land is after about, I would say, turn 4, and in standard tends to last till at least turn 6 for the most part. Given the proper situation, this has only come into play untapped about 50% of the time, I would say, because after turn 4, you're likely not going to draw too many lands. So if this is your 4th land, so if you have 3 lands in hand, then you draw this one on turn 4, you have no more lands in hand, so you have nothing to reveal with it. Which is why I say, like, if you want it on turn 1 or turn 2, then I could see it, for the justification. But in standard, being able to play this, play it untapped on turn 1, it's not really that important, because most games will go pretty deep. Turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, most of the time. Barring monocolored aggro decks, which wouldn't play these dual lands anyway. So I think in the context of this current standard format, it makes these worse. Because when to be playing, like, say you're playing a mid-range deck that's even 2 colors, for example, and you get to turn 4, you're like, I need my 4th land, or I need my 5th land. Every time I draw one of these cards, it costs me the game almost every single time. Now, with the other cycle lands from Crimson Vow, it comes into play tap unless you control 2 or more of the lands. So basically, starting on turn 3, these start coming into play on tap on their own, and you don't need help. Which, again, if you've watched any of my videos, I'm all for that. So I value these dual lands a lot higher than the Strixhaven dual lands, given the current standard format. Now, will it change? Maybe. As we get more sets into this format, it potentially could change. We could potentially see, maybe another cycle of dual lands that count as both island and mountain that will come into play on tap. Maybe you see the shock lands again. Who knows? If that's the case, then I could see them improving in value. Right now, they just don't. They just really don't. The aggressive decks in the standard format are almost always monocolored. There's some of them that are 2-colored. But most of the ones that I see that are 2-colored don't play these Strixhaven duels. So overvalued, overplayed. Maybe just I have a small grudge against these cards. I'm not sure, because they've cost me games before. It would have to be the Strixhaven dual lands. So that's I guess it ended up being 6 overplayed, overvalued cards, 1 for each color, and then 1 for the gold artifacts and lands. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.